and as you know, very few people fly for the sake of flying. People fly somewhere to do something. So we need to understand this interdependence. We need to understand all these relationships that develop, and in addition, to any love and hate relationships, which is usually what airlines and airport bring together, we need to understand synergies as well. So essentially, what we talk here is a business triangle. We have the airline, the airport, the tourist destination authority, usually in the context of a DMO, but might be a destination management organization or a destination marketing organization. The idea is to bring them together in order to generate a triple win situation. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is at high level. It's the last presentation. I'm not going to bombard you with numbers. It's essentially conceptual. So I'm going to show you a framework about how to move forward, a kind of a roadmap, how we can possibly build a partnership between these three stakeholders, what are the driving forces behind, and also because destination marketing is very important, I'm going to briefly outline a potential branding strategy, very much in the context of co-creation, which becomes increasingly important in social media. So essentially, my story is about route development, taking into consideration different stakeholders. And in my opinion, we can identify 4 different generations of route development, 3 plus 1. So in the very beginning, that was, let's say, up to the 1980s, before the opening up of the market, everything was simple, easy. It was a one-man show at a domestic level. It was governed by bilaterals at an international level. So airlines belong to the states, airports belong to the states, tourist destinations were governed by the state. So all these transactions about bringing things forward were very simple, but they were not terribly efficient. And everything was governed by politics rather than economics. So there was limited interaction at different levels. Then we gradually moved into the second generation of route development, where after the opening up of the market, airlines became quite proactive. We saw the development of different network configurations, including hub and spoke. So as a result, airlines wanted to make money. They wanted to leave any routes that were unprofitable, and they started communicating with airports about how they can make money. At that time, most airports were still state-owned and mostly reactive, and in many cases, tourist destination authorities were just working together with airports. Gradually, because of the opening up of the market, we saw more levels of interaction, and then we moved to the third generation, which is what we experience at present in many cases, where we have an opening up not only of the airline market, also the airport market. We have gradual commercialization, we have privatization of airports, so they also become quite interested in generating a win-win situation. They're interested in becoming proactive rather than reactive in the past. So you now have proactive airlines and airports coming together, joining forces in order to generate a double win situation, and in many cases they go to tourist destination authorities asking for a direct and indirect aid, which is very much related to the topic discussed earlier. So what we gradually see is interaction developing at different levels, what we call globalization, a combination of what happens at a global level but also at a local level. So we have strategic alliances at a world level, but then we have tourist destinations getting into negotiations with low-cost carriers and so on. So this is where we are at present, but I think that we are gradually moving to the fourth generation, which is about rising complexity, very much related to the fact that destinations become gradually disillusioned. So about 10 years ago or 15 years ago, when we had all this low-cost carrier revolution, a number of tourist destination authorities, especially in Mediterranean countries like Greece or Italy or Spain, they thought that low-cost carriers could be a messiah. They could bring lots of new tourists, and that would be to the benefit of the destination, which may be true. However, we need to understand that destinations have limited budgets. At present, many of them are battered by deficits, which means that they cannot continue this way. And as analyzed by Mario earlier on, there is always this issue about illegal subsidies. And on top of that, we need to understand that the relationship between airports and tourist destination authorities is also characterized by potential disalignment of incentives. So both airlines and airports are interested in promoting outbound and inbound traffic at a point-to-point, at a network level. The destination is only interested into inbound tourism. And the other thing is about airport cities, which is a lovely concept, but potentially that can bring some antagonism from local tourist destination authorities, meaning if people spend money in the airport duty-frees or in other concessions around the airport and not at the tourism center, they don't stay, let's say, at local hotels, that's not good for the destination. And we also need to consider what happens with administration and tax jurisdiction there as well. So as a result, it means that things are becoming increasingly complex. We need to understand how to bring the three entities together in order to generate a triple win situation. And since this conference is primarily about financials and about investment, what seems to be extremely important here is to try to find a nice balance between returns and risks. So most of you know much more than I do regarding financial risk. Where I want to place my emphasis now is on what we call asset specificity and sunk costs. So a sunk cost is a fixed cost that cannot be recovered, and one of the major sources of risk, in my opinion, is what we call an asset that is too specific and it's not easily transferable. And we can actually identify specificity at three different levels: location, function, and user. So by definition, an airport is location specific. You cannot put an airport into Wales and take it elsewhere. So that's always a big problem, a potential risk of any kind of infrastructure. Again, airlines may be functionally specific because they very much depend on aircraft, and you can do very few things with an aircraft apart from flying. But the worst case of specificity is user specificity. So if I'm an airport and I decide to develop a low-cost terminal, this is very much related to a specific type of profile of clients. So that's user specificity at a class level. Even worse, if I decide to develop a new pier for a specific low-cost carrier that might not interest somebody else, that would be an individual specificity, and obviously this brings further problems. So what we need to identify is the level of specificity at different levels regarding labor skills, and obviously in the case of airports, it's primarily with respect to capital and equipment. Then it's about dependency, and whether we end up putting all our eggs into one basket or not. With my team, we have developed what we call the ADI, the Airport Development and Dependency Index, which does show whether an airport has diversified its base or not. So many airports do suffer from very high seasonality. And so if something happens, let's say during August or during July in a nice Greek regional airport, it might be in huge trouble from a year-end perspective. Again, we need to consider a spatial dependency, whether you depend on just a few cities or a few countries. And user specificity as well is very important. What happens if your flag carrier, your major carrier at the airport goes bankrupt? Will somebody else fill the gap? What happens with other partners in the supply chain as well? Then it's about the general environment, the general stochasticity, as we say, an unpredictability that may emerge, typically related in the context of a pestle analysis, political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal. But it may be also internal, not just external. And in terms of internal, we need to understand the frequency of encounters. How often, for example, an airport has transactions with a low-cost carrier or any other carrier? What type of behavior is developing there? So what we need to do at a strategic level is exactly to understand all these different potential problems, all the different risks related to specificity, dependency, stochasticity, explicitly acknowledge them, and then try either to compensate them or at least do something to reduce them. But the real problem here is that in many cases, in this context of risk hedging, we end up using policies that might not work terribly well. So what about the three fallacies that we need to consider here? And what I have in my screen here is an example of a white elephant. I don't know if you're aware of them, but they do exist, but they are very rare. they're regarded as sacred animals, and they are the perfect recipe if you want to destroy your opponent. So you give them a wild elephant as a gift, because it's a gift, they cannot give it to somebody else. They have to feed them because they're a sacred animal, and eventually that's a huge problem. So how is this related to infrastructure? Well, in many cases you may hear investors or managers of, let's say, an airport say, okay, I'm a small airport, what I'm going to do now is to increase my scale, because that will help me improve my competitive position. So from just being a small regional airport, I may even develop a small regional hub, which is a good idea. I mean, in principle, it can reduce dependency, you can get more airlines, so rising user numbers, you can get an enhanced reprofiling, which is very good for airport marketing, but the big risk here is that you may get deeper into what we call locational and functional specificity. So if things work well, that's great. If they don't, you're in trouble. And very recently, in Europe, we've seen a number of airports that didn't really pick up. We've seen examples in Spain. We saw the European Court of First Instance talking about subsidies and about cases of airports where things did not go as well as expected. And even worse, you may suffer from escalation of commitment. So just believing that, okay, it's just temporary, you may end up deciding to plunge even more funds into your infrastructure, and then you have something that it's really, really difficult to manage from a financial point of view. What about the second fallacy? The second fallacy is related to what we call the winner's curse. So that is the case of auctions where in game theory, where you realize that you may end up having paid too much for an asset or for a specific partnership. So in many cases, for example, somebody might think, okay, it's very important to go ahead with one big partner, whether it's an airline or a ground handler or whatever, because just focusing on one partner allows me to develop a strategic relationship, reduces transaction costs, and what I would need to do in that case is outbid my competitors. So getting into a bidding process, give much money in order to attract, let's say, a super low-cost carrier into my regional airport. Does this make sense? Well, in retrospect, sometimes it does not, because again, what you do is you tie your hands. You end up being just with one partner. It might work for a while, but in the longer term, it might create other problems. It increases, using the previous framework, what we call user specificity and dependency. And what about the third fallacy to consider? This is what we call a tandem bike, and it can be ideal if everybody does the job. But you know, the real temptation here is for somebody to just take an easy ride or a free ride. So enjoy the scenery while the others are doing the job. And this is what in economics we call coordination failure. So in theory, everybody may contribute to the joint effort, and that might be our aspiration. So a tourism authority might have said yes to the airport when they go together to an airline, and when the tourism authority realizes that the political cycle is going to change, maybe the local mayor is not going to be re-elected, maybe the relationships with the local chamber of commerce or the local hoteliers has changed. So in the end, you know, you end up having problems. So we have what we call free riding and coordination failure. So three different fallacies to consider, and quite important because we're talking about assets which are valuable and in many cases characterized by specificity. So is there a solution to this impasse? Well, if we just look at stakeholders from an individual point of view, if all they're interested in is just focusing on their own interest, it's not going to work very well. What we need to do is, there is a common future here. So we need to do, first of all, a detailed mapping of the revenue and cost structure of each of the involved people in the negotiation in order to generate a win-win-win situation. Therefore, we need constructive negotiations. Of course, each of the involved parties have their own power in the game. They have a different bargaining in power. We need to understand the level of dependencies. But what we need to do is try to go ahead with what we would call a tripartite agreement. As Mario said earlier, there are legal constraints. So we need to understand, but especially in Europe, there are issues with state aid. We need to make sure that we comply with the private investors criterion. But subject to dealing with such legal constraints, ideally what we would like to see is a long-term trilateral agreement. Trilateral means that it involves all three parties, and this should be complemented by a marketing agreement. What we need to do here is to explicitly acknowledge the importance of airport charges, for example, what structural changes need to be introduced, and also, and especially from an airport point of view, we may need to see the emergence of what we call an investment hostage, which in many cases may even lead to some sort of vertical governance between an airline and an airport, possibly with the participation of a local authority. So just to be a bit more specific, main problems with airports is they might be afraid that their infrastructure is not going to be properly utilized. And again, it's a matter of money. And an airline always keeps complaining about high airport charges. So what we could possibly do is to see a case where an airport accepts a lower aeronautical revenue if, of course, it's led to have a rise in non-aeronautical revenue. So a dual till, for example, could help here perhaps. And also, the bigger desire of an airport is to have somebody to contribute to the financing of its infrastructure. So if we can have an agreement which ties, let's say, aeronautical charges to the level of financing of infrastructure, and if we end up having partial financial support of infrastructure by the other two stakeholders, that could be of help. Again, what about an airline? An airline flying to a new, relatively unknown destination. The big problem for them is what happens in case the route does not pick up. What happens if all the forecasts prove wrong? Again, an airline usually would ask for an indirect subsidy. In many cases, that might take the option of advertising income by the local tourism authority or the local chamber of commerce or another local stakeholder. What could be the case is that if the local authority can commit to that they're going to have a branding exercise in order to improve the overall brand name of a destination, that would bring the risk at lower levels for the airline. Santorini or Mykonos, they're known at a world level. They don't expect a local sky to go there to discover them. So that would be the case for small regional airports and small destinations. If they can commit to improving the overall brand name, an airline might be more agreeable to lower indirect subsidies or any kind of other aid. Again, it's important for the airport to be involved there. We need to agree to fix reduced charges over a long period of time. Again, a tourism authority does not want to be accused of illegal aids. They don't want to have nightmares. It's also the political cycle. You don't want your opponents in the opposition to get rid of you by saying that you are a corrupted politician and you had a secretive agreement with airlines and airports. So what a tourism authority would like to do is, again, make sure that they don't funnel exclusively money to involved stakeholders. So they may accept some tax concessions, they may provide some services to partnering airline and airport. However, what they want to do is to get control of their overall promotional budget and make sure that, again, they don't put all their eggs into one basket. Finally, what we need to consider here is a social media strategy, which I think is important, and what seems to be evolving in destination marketing, but also increasingly in airport marketing as well, is what we call co-creation. That means that you bring together the different stakeholders. So in that case, it would be an airline, an airport, and a destination authority. However, they work social media not only on what we call a stakeholder to visit or an S2V relationship, but also a V2V relationship. So what you actually want to do here is to actively engage visitors and exchange ideas with them through social media about how you can jointly develop a destination. And obviously, if people want to go to the destination, that's very good news for route development, which means very good news for airlines and airports as well. So social media strategy is emerging as a major issue in this triangular relationship, and I think it makes very good sense because it's not expensive, and especially among millennials, it can be extremely popular. So to finalize, summarize, and conclude my presentation, I think it's very, very important to understand this relationship. I mean, many of the lovely presentations I heard in the previous 3 days were about tourism, but I don't think they analyzed tourism as explicitly as could have been the case. So airlines and airports, we typically talk about this love and hate relationship, but in the end people would need to consider what happens at the destination level as well. What we need here is to generate a triple win situation, understand what the strategical and structural interdependencies are about. We need to understand the risk sharing. We talked about the different levels of specificity, of dependency, of uncertainty, and global level, at a local level. So risk sharing is very, very important as well. And obviously what you need is efficient and effective negotiators, which should be skilled and they should be enlightened. And we had this lovely session yesterday evening. If you remember, one of the main words here was trust. You need to build trust with your other partners. If you're just, as we say here, transactional, if you're just interested in a one-off relationship, things will not going to work. Ideally, what you would need to do is to become relational and possibly transformational. And you know, airports, they love long-term horizon. It's in the nature of infrastructure. Tourist destination authorities are obviously interested in the long term. It's how you can actually persuade airlines to focus on this strategy as well and be in a position to generate a triple win situation. So that's all from me, and thank you very much. Happy to take any questions. Thank you.